Vienna, autumn of 1618. Inside a glittering hall, candles flickered, silver goblets clinked, and Archduke Maximilian of Austria, prince of the mighty Habsburg dynasty, raised his glass in triumph. But only hours later, the laughter had turned to silence. He collapsed, gripped by searing stomach pain, vomiting until his body could bear no more. By dawn, the Archduke was dead at 63. Was it food? Was it fate? Or was it a calculated act, an invisible hand striking at the heart of empire? Archduke Maximilian was born on April 13, 1555, in Vienna, into the most powerful dynasty of Europe, the House of Habsburg. His father was Emperor Maximilian II of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler admired for his diplomacy and tolerance. His mother, Maria of Spain, was the daughter of Emperor Charles V, a woman steeped in the traditions of Spanish Catholic piety. From his very first breath, Maximilian carried the burden of two worlds: the Habsburg heritage of Central Europe and the Spanish line of uncompromising Catholic rule. He was not born a pauper, nor a forgotten child in the shadows of a city. His cradle was trimmed with gold, guarded by nurses who whispered prayers over his tiny form. Courtiers gathered to watch him grow, noting every gesture as though it foreshadowed destiny. From the outside, this was a boy marked for greatness. Yet from the inside, there was an unspoken truth. He was not the firstborn. He was not the chosen heir. He was, from the very beginning, the second son. This detail, so small at first, would shape his life like an invisible chain. For in dynasties such as the Habsburgs, the eldest was prepared for the crown, while the younger sons were assigned to other paths of duty, of service, of sacrifice. Maximilian learned early what this meant. The throne he could see was a throne he could never touch. Still, his education was rigorous. Tutors versed in Latin, philosophy, and law came to his chambers. He read Cicero, Aristotle, and Augustine. He was taught to pray with discipline, to fence with precision, to debate with eloquence. He absorbed music and painting, the currents of Renaissance humanism flowing around the Habsburg court. To an outsider, he seemed every bit the equal of his elder brother Rudolf, who would one day inherit the imperial crown, but equality was an illusion. For every triumph, every praise, Maximilian was reminded, your place is not on the throne, but beside it. The paradox grew sharper as he aged. In court processions, he marched in fine armor, but one step behind his brother. In portraits, he was painted with dignity, but his gaze never carried the weight of sovereignty. In the family's whispered discussions, alliances and marriages were considered for Rudolf, while for Maximilian the question was different. What use could be made of him? The answer, as it so often was for younger Habsburg princes, lay in the church. The dynasty's survival depended not just on kings and emperors, but also on archbishops, cardinals, and grand masters. Loyal men bound not to wives or children, but to the family itself. And so, when Maximilian was still in his 20s, his path was sealed. He was named Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, one of the most prestigious religious military institutions of the Catholic world. To the world, this was honor. To Maximilian, it was a cage. For with that title came vows. Vows that meant he could not marry, could not have children, could not build a private dynasty of his own. His blood would not continue. His name, though noble, would end with him. In the echoing halls of Vienna's palaces, he must have felt both elevated and diminished. Elevated by the grandeur of his title, diminished by the knowledge that he would always live in the shadow of others. The irony was bitter. He was a prince of Austria, brother to emperors, a man who dined on silver plates beneath painted ceilings. Yet when he looked beyond the marble columns and gilded chapels, he saw no future that was his own. He was to be a servant of the dynasty, not its master, a guardian of faith, not a founder of legacies. Still, Maximilian embraced his duties with diligence. He presided over councils, attended religious ceremonies, traveled as a representative of the empire. He played the role assigned to him with grace. But beneath the surface, a quieter drama unfolded, a loneliness that gnawed at him in silence. For unlike his brothers, who married princesses of Spain or France, who had children and dynasties of their own, Maximilian lived in a palace without heirs. His chambers were filled with books, relics, and symbols of faith, but never with the laughter of children, never with the warmth of a partner. It is here, in this paradox, that the first cracks of tragedy appeared. A man surrounded by splendor, but cut off from the simplest joys of life. A man praised in ceremonies, but forgotten in the chronicles of succession. Perhaps he found comfort in prayer or in the solemn brotherhood of the Teutonic Knights. Perhaps he drowned his regrets in banquets, in the fleeting intoxication of wine and music. But history does not record his private sighs, only his public duties. And that silence, the silence of a man who could never voice his longing, is as haunting as any death. For Maximilian's story was never about the crown he did not wear, but about the emptiness left behind by what he was denied. And so, as Europe inched toward chaos and war, Maximilian carried within him both the dignity of a prince and the sorrow of a man who knew that even his victories would never be his own. To understand Archduke Maximilian's life is to see the difference between appearance and reality. On the surface, he lived in the glow of imperial privilege. His clothes were sewn from velvet, his meals served on gilded plates, his audiences filled with courtiers who bowed deeply at his presence. Yet beneath this veneer, his path was not chosen by him, but for him. Every Habsburg child was born into duty, and for Maximilian, duty meant sacrifice. When his elder brothers were matched with daughters of kings and queens, forging alliances that stretched across Europe, Maximilian watched from the sidelines. He saw the elaborate wedding ceremonies, the exchange of rings and vows, the birth of children that would secure dynastic futures. He celebrated those occasions as a loyal brother. But each celebration reminded him of his own absence in such matters. His family had decided long before he would not marry. He would not sire a line of heirs. Instead, he was bound to the church, tethered to vows of celibacy and service. He became Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, a title laden with history and honor. Once, the Teutonic Knights had been warriors of the Crusades, defenders of Christendom, rulers of lands along the Baltic. By Maximilian's time, the order had lost much of its power, reduced to ceremonial prestige. It was still dignified, still respected, but more a relic of the past than an engine of the future. For Maximilian, this was the paradox. He was draped in the robes of authority, yet behind those robes was emptiness. He presided over chapters and ceremonies, led processions through cathedral halls, blessed nights with the sign of the cross. His voice echoed in Latin prayers, his hand lifted chalices of consecrated wine. But when the incense faded and the crowds dispersed, he was left alone. Alone in a palace chamber where no wife waited, no children slept, no legacy stirred. Did he dream of another life? Historians cannot say. The records are quiet on his private emotions. But one does not need diaries to imagine the ache. To be young, educated, and vigorous, yet told that love itself was forbidden. To watch one's brothers cradle their newborn children, to see dynasties expand, while knowing that your bloodline would vanish into silence. It was a peculiar kind of captivity, not iron chains, but golden ones. Maximilian was not imprisoned in dungeons or towers. His prison was ceremonial duty, the suffocating dignity of being forever a supporting figure, never the central one. His gilded cage was the cathedral, his chains were vows, his jailers the traditions of his dynasty. Still, Maximilian sought meaning in his role. He represented the Habsburgs in negotiations with princes and bishops. He stood as a symbol of Catholic loyalty during years when the Reformation fractured Europe. He accompanied campaigns against the Ottoman Turks, lending his name and presence to battles he did not truly command. He was not idle. He was not forgotten. Yet in all these endeavors, there was always the same truth. He acted not for himself, but as an instrument of the dynasty. There is tragedy in such lives, tragedy not of failure, but of absence, an absence of self. His hopes, fragile and private, were clipped before they could bloom. If ever he had thought of romance, it was extinguished by duty. If ever he dreamed of children, it was replaced by the cold reality of vows. And yet, he endured year after year, fulfilling the roles expected of him with diligence and discipline. What remains haunting is how history remembers him. His brothers became emperors, kings, fathers of new dynasties. Their names live in treaties, battles, and genealogies. Maximilian's name, by contrast, is often a footnote. Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, died in 1618. A title, a date, an ending. But behind that footnote was a man, flesh, blood, longing. A man who lived 6 decades in the glare of imperial light, but carried within him the shadow of what he was denied. And so we see him, not as a villain, not as a failure, but as something far more human. A man caught between privilege and loss. He had castles but no home, titles but no legacy, prayers but no intimacy. This was the fragile hope of Archduke Maximilian. Not to conquer kingdoms or win crowns, but perhaps simply to be remembered as more than a footnote. A hope that would flicker quietly through his life until the night when pain, poison, or fate would extinguish it forever. As Archduke Maximilian grew older, his role as Grand Master of the Teutonic Order shifted from youthful initiation to seasoned obligation. He no longer stood in the shadow of childhood expectation, but in the heavy cloak of adulthood, where every step was dictated by protocol, every word weighed against dynastic strategy. His presence was required in courts from Vienna to Prague, in councils where treaties were drafted and alliances bartered. He was dispatched as an envoy to neighboring states, not to speak his own will, but to recite the voice of the Habsburg dynasty. When ambassadors looked at him, they did not see a man. They saw the empire embodied in a secondary prince, a representative, a spare piece in the machinery of power. This was the paradox that gnawed at Maximilian. He was essential and yet expendable. His signature mattered on documents, his presence was necessary in negotiations, but his person, the man within the robes, remained replaceable. For every task assigned to him, another Habsburg cousin could have taken his place. It was not Maximilian himself who mattered, but the seal of Habsburg authority he carried in his blood. Still, he persevered. He accompanied imperial forces in campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, standing among generals and commanders as they sketched battle lines on maps. He wore armor, mounted horses, and inspected troops. Chroniclers noted his participation, but never his command. He was a figurehead, an emblem of the dynasty's commitment to Christendom's wars. Soldiers cheered him because of his name, not his victories. His presence was reassurance, but never decisive action. In these years, Maximilian must have felt the strange loneliness of being at the center of the crowd, but never its leader. He could stand at banquets where kings toasted his health. Yet behind the clinking of goblets, whispers always reminded him he was the other Archduke, the brother of emperors, not an emperor himself. He could ride at the head of a procession, yet know that when the trumpets blared, it was not his triumph they celebrated, but the glory of the dynasty that used him as ornament. It is here that his story acquires tension, not from rebellion, but from resignation. He did not revolt against his role. He fulfilled it faithfully. Yet the more he served, the clearer it became that his life was designed to orbit others, never to blaze its own path. When European politics demanded symbolic gestures, Maximilian was often chosen. He was sent to attend diets of the Holy Roman Empire, to mediate disputes, to bless Catholic victories with his presence. But the machinery of power treated him like a pawn that could be moved, shifted, or sacrificed without consequence. He was visible, but voiceless. And while his brothers and cousins secured dynastic futures through marriage, Maximilian stood apart. The Teutonic Order, in theory, offered him a brotherhood. Yet even there, the sense of belonging was incomplete. The knights around him swore loyalty not to him, but to the institution he represented. The grand halls where they gathered rang with hymns and prayers. But at night, the silence returned. The silence of a man who had no family to embrace, no children to inherit his name, no confidant to share his doubts. This life, half ceremonial, half political, eroded the possibility of personal joy. Maximilian was respected, yes. He was honored, certainly. But he was not loved in the way a husband is loved, not remembered in the way a father is remembered. His duty consumed what might have been his humanity. And yet, he was no failure. His contemporaries recognized his diligence, his loyalty, his unwavering performance of the roles assigned to him. He represented Habsburg stability at a time when Europe was a tinderbox of religious conflict. But therein lay the tragedy. Maximilian's competence only reinforced his confinement. Because he did his duty well, he was never released from it. Because he played this role faithfully, he was never granted a stage of his own. This was not a life of open disgrace or scandal. It was something subtler and perhaps crueler. A life of being perpetually useful, but never central. Of being present in history's footnotes, but never in its headlines. And so the tension builds. For what happens to a man who spends 6 decades as a symbol rather than a self? What happens when his body, once disciplined for ceremony, begins to fail him? And what if, in the shifting storms of empire, a single banquet would become the setting for his most mysterious and tragic act? The title of Grand Master of the Teutonic Order sounded like triumph. It carried with it centuries of legacy, crusades in the Baltic, castles on windswept plains, banners adorned with black crosses. To the outside world, Archduke Maximilian of Austria seemed draped in grandeur. But in reality, the title was hollow. By the early 17th century, the Teutonic Order had long since lost its crusading power. Its territories were gone, its armies diminished, its influence reduced to ritual and ceremony. Maximilian lived not as a warrior commanding knights into battle, but as a prince presiding over an institution whose glory belonged to the past. He wore ornate robes, signed solemn decrees, and processed through cathedral aisles where incense rose in clouds of ritual piety. Yet when the smoke cleared, he was left with little more than echoing halls and ceremonial duties. He had prestige, but not real authority. Vienna surrounded him with magnificence. Palaces of marble, ceilings painted with saints, banquet halls filled with music, all were his daily environment. And yet, within that magnificence was a suffocating solitude. He had no wife to confide in, no children to carry on his name, no court of loyal followers who rallied to his personal banner. He was encircled by courtiers, priests, and servants, but few of them truly belonged to him. They belonged to the dynasty, to the order, to the machinery of empire. In this contradiction lay the silent tragedy of Maximilian. He was exalted, yet alone. He walked among marble pillars and tapestries woven with gold, but the splendor became his prison. The palace that others envied became his cage, a prison made not of iron, but of velvet and stone. The rituals of power deepened his solitude. Day after day, he presided over ceremonies where oaths were sworn and blessings pronounced. His lips repeated the words of faith. His hands traced the sign of the cross. His presence confirmed the dignity of the institution. But these rituals, rather than filling his spirit, drained it. They reminded him of what he was forbidden to have: intimacy, companionship, the warmth of family life. At banquets, the isolation was sharper still. He sat at long tables laden with roasted meats, spiced wines, and silver platters of delicacies. Musicians played in the background, courtiers raised their cups, and laughter swirled like smoke through the hall. Yet even here, Maximilian was set apart. His position demanded dignity, restraint, a performance of formality that set him above, but also away from those around him. The more luxurious the table, the colder the seat at its head. History rarely records his private words. We do not know if he raged against his role, or if he accepted it with stoic calm. But the silence of the sources itself is telling. Maximilian left no heirs, no diaries, no letters of love or longing. What survives are official documents, decrees, grants, ceremonial signatures. His public record is complete. His private voice is absent. And in that absence, we can sense the weight of his isolation. As the years passed, the contrast between his title and his reality grew more painful. He was called Grand Master, but had little mastery over the forces shaping Europe. He was addressed as Archduke, yet had no duchy of his own. He was hailed as a Habsburg prince, but remained peripheral to the family's central dramas of succession and empire. This tension between grandeur and emptiness was not unique to Maximilian. Many royal children shared it, bound into celibacy, cloistered into church offices. But in Maximilian's case, it lingered into old age. Decade after decade, he remained where he had always been, not at the center, but at the margins, dressed in gold, yet starved of intimacy. It is perhaps no wonder, then, that whispers surrounded him. Whispers of melancholy, whispers of frustration, whispers that behind the polished exterior lay a man quietly crushed by loneliness. For when one has everything and yet nothing, palaces without love, titles without power, ceremonies without joy, the soul begins to erode. This erosion is what sets the stage for his final chapter. For when he sat at a banquet in Vienna in the autumn of 1618, surrounded by the glow of candles and the hum of music, he was not merely another guest. He was a man whose life had been a long solitude, whose role had been duty without legacy, whose power was hollow. And when he collapsed in agony that night, clutching his stomach, vomiting until he could no longer stand. It was not only his body that failed. It was the culmination of a lifetime of silent isolation. Thus, the tension sharpens. A prince with every title but no true power. A grand master who commanded only shadows. And a man who, at the end of his life, would be remembered not for what he ruled, but for how he died. Suddenly, painfully, and suspiciously, in the glow of a banquet hall that doubled as his stage and his grave, October 1618. Vienna was restless. Beyond its walls, Europe smoldered. The defenestration of Prague had flung 2 royal officials from a castle window only months before, igniting the first sparks of what would become the 30 Years' War. Catholic and Protestant princes maneuvered like chess pieces, each move threatening to collapse the fragile balance of power. Inside Vienna, however, the Habsburg court sought to maintain appearances. Music still echoed through marble halls, feasts were still held. And Archduke Maximilian, though older and frailer, still took his place among the glittering company of nobles. The banquet that autumn was typical in its splendor. Silver trays carried pheasant and venison. Goblets of Rhine wine and Hungarian Tokaj sparkled in the candlelight. Harpsichords hummed while courtiers toasted the dynasty's power. To the untrained eye, it was a scene of stability, a reaffirmation that the House of Habsburg remained unshaken, even as Europe lurched toward chaos. But behind the formality lay unease. Some at court whispered that Maximilian was a man out of time, a relic of the dynasty whose lack of heirs and influence made him politically expendable. Others suspected that, in a moment when Catholic solidarity was crucial, a prince like Maximilian, respected but sidelined, could become either a tool or a threat. He raised his goblet that night as tradition demanded, his hand steady despite his 63 years. The hall erupted in applause. To all appearances, he was still a Habsburg prince, solemn, dignified, resilient. Yet as the evening stretched on, as course after course was served, something shifted. It began with discomfort, an ache low in his stomach, a tightening that made him press a hand against his robes. At first he dismissed it. Banquets were heavy, rich with spiced meats and thick sauces. Indigestion was common. He forced a smile, nodded to his neighbors, drank another sip of wine. But the pain did not fade. It sharpened. It spread like fire through his abdomen. His vision blurred. Sweat broke across his brow. When he tried to rise, his legs trembled. Moments later, the hall fell into silence as Maximilian collapsed, his goblet clattering against the stone floor. Witnesses rushed to his side. Some whispered prayers, others called for physicians. Servants scattered, fetching water, cloths, and remedies. The music ceased, replaced by the groans of a man twisting in agony. He vomited violently, the feast he had consumed only hours earlier, spilling in crimson streaks of wine across the marble. His face contorted with pain, his body convulsed as if racked by some invisible hand. The court physicians could do little. They spoke of fever, of poisoned humors, of a malignant flux. Remedies were applied, herbs, bleeding, poultices, but nothing stemmed the tide of agony. His stomach cramped, his breath came shallow, his skin grew clammy. The air in the banquet hall, once perfumed with spices and incense, now reeked of bile and fear. And then came the whispers. Was this merely gluttony punished by the frailties of age? Or was it something darker? Poison was a familiar specter in European courts. A powder slipped into wine, a tincture mixed with sauce. Such methods had silenced inconvenient rivals before. Some looked at Maximilian's plate, others at his goblet. Questions spread like wildfire. Why him? Why now? The timing was uncanny. Europe was entering its most catastrophic war in centuries. The Habsburg dynasty, defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, needed unity. Yet within that unity, rivalries festered. Some factions considered Maximilian a stabilizing presence, others a potential liability. Was his sudden collapse merely chance? Or had someone decided the empire could no longer afford a prince without heirs? A man whose existence was ceremonial rather than strategic. In the days that followed, his condition worsened. Reports speak of unrelenting vomiting, fever that burned and chilled in cycles, stomach pain so severe that he clawed at his own body. He drifted between consciousness and delirium, whispering prayers one moment, groaning curses the next. His attendants noted the speed of his decline, far faster than typical illness. Officially, the court declared that Maximilian had been struck by a violent fever following a banquet. Nothing more. But the shadows of rumor never dispersed. Some said he had been targeted by Protestant agents eager to destabilize the Habsburgs. Others suggested it was internal, Catholic rivals seeking to remove a prince who no longer served dynastic purpose. The simplest explanation, food poisoning, lingered too. But was it likely that only Maximilian had suffered, and none of the others at the banquet? The ambiguity was damning. It meant his death, whether by chance or design, became part of a wider narrative of suspicion, secrecy, and silence. Thus, the banquet became not a celebration, but a curse. The glittering hall that night transformed into a stage for agony. And as Maximilian's body withered in the days after, Europe's great conflict had already begun outside the palace walls. His death, sudden and violent, would soon be written off as an unfortunate illness. Yet in the murmurs of courtiers, in the dispatches of ambassadors, and in the silence of official records, one question lingered. Did Archduke Maximilian of Austria die by fate, or by the hand of those who found his life inconvenient? By late October 1618, the rumors in Vienna spread faster than the physicians who moved in and out of Archduke Maximilian's chamber. The banquet had ended days earlier, yet the echoes of that evening lingered in his body like a curse that would not release him. His attendants whispered of sleepless nights, of the groans that reverberated down the corridors, of the stench of sickness seeping even through the carved oak doors. The physicians, men steeped more in ritual than in science, tried their remedies. They bled him with leeches, believing excess humors caused the violent spasms. They burned herbs, filling his chamber with acrid smoke. They pressed cold cloths against his temples, prayed over relics, and administered draughts of wine laced with crushed pearls or ground antimony. Nothing worked. Each day his stomach pain worsened, his vomiting returned, his fever swung between icy chills and fiery sweats. Maximilian had once carried himself with the dignity of a Habsburg prince. Robed in silk, shoulders squared, gaze steady. But now that body betrayed him. His once strong frame weakened, his hands shook uncontrollably, his skin turned pale as candle wax. He could hardly raise himself from bed. Courtiers who were admitted briefly described him as sunk into shadow. Some claimed he no longer recognized familiar faces. Others said his eyes darted as though searching for unseen enemies in the corners of the room. By November 1st, the crisis had reached its peak. Maximilian lay half-conscious, muttering fragments of prayers, sometimes lapsing into silence so complete that his attendants thought him dead. His body convulsed with violent cramps. When water was offered, he retched immediately. When food was pressed to his lips, he turned away, whispering, "Poison." It is easy to imagine the chamber, the flickering candles, the heavy curtains drawn against the autumn chill, the muffled footsteps of physicians pacing. the low murmur of prayers whispered by chaplains at his side. The air thick with incense meant to purify, yet unable to disguise the scent of sweat and vomit that clung to the bedding. And then came the final descent. On the morning of November 2nd, Maximilian cried out with such force that guards outside rushed in, only to find him twisted in agony. He clawed at the sheets, his back arched, his teeth clenched. The priests recited last rites even as he writhed. His voice, once formal and commanding in cathedral halls, now broke into ragged pleas. "Mercy," he was said to have whispered. "Mercy." No family crowded around his bed. No children clutched his hand. No heir awaited his blessing. He died not as the scion of a mighty dynasty, but as a solitary figure, attended only by servants bound to secrecy. The once proud Archduke who had represented Habsburg honor across Europe now slipped into death as though swallowed by the silence of his own chamber. By nightfall, the struggle was over. His breathing slowed, then ceased. His body, drenched in sweat, lay still at last. The chaplains closed his eyes. The physicians recorded the official cause: acute fever following a sudden illness. No mention of poison, no suggestion of foul play, just illness, the most convenient veil. Yet among those who had witnessed his torment, doubt lingered. Could ordinary fever strike so swiftly, so violently after a banquet? Could natural illness explain the timing, at the very moment Europe spiraled into war? Or had Maximilian been silenced deliberately, his removal hidden behind the mask of disease? The court did not encourage such questions. The body was prepared quickly, wrapped in cloth, perfumed to disguise decay. Couriers carried news in cautious, neutral language. The Archduke had succumbed to illness, nothing more. No alarm was raised, no mourning decreed. And so, in the cruelest of ironies, Maximilian's final hour was marked not by trumpets or bells, but by hurried silence. A Habsburg prince, dead at 63, after days of agony that no physician could ease and no priest could explain. His death was an end, but also an erasure. The climax had come. The banquet that should have been celebration became his undoing. The chamber that should have been sanctuary became his tomb. And the dynasty that should have mourned chose instead to move on, leaving behind a body, a rumor, and a silence that history would never quite dispel. Vienna, the city of spires and cloisters, carried on with its heartbeat as if Maximilian had never existed. The markets filled with noise. Bakers shouted their prices, bells rang for weddings and baptisms, and soldiers drilled in the courtyards of the Hofburg. Life was unrelenting in its continuation. Yet beneath the surface, whispers threaded through the taverns and cloisters. Did the Archduke die from poisoned wine? Did the Jesuits silence him? Or was it God's punishment for pride? These murmurs were smoke without flame, circulating endlessly, but never allowed to ignite into truth. The Habsburg family closed its ranks with the precision of a military formation. Official bulletins described his death as natural, a sudden illness of the stomach, tragic but not suspicious. Courtiers were instructed to speak of his piety and his service to the Teutonic Order, never of the agony in his final hours. His name was removed from the active rolls of court affairs almost overnight, as if an eraser had passed across parchment. And so, Maximilian's funeral became less a state event and more a private chore. He was laid to rest with dignity, yes, but without the full weight of imperial ceremony that usually accompanied a prince of his stature. No grand procession through the city, no lavish mourning period decreed by the emperor. Instead, a muted service in the Augustinian church, the same sacred ground where so many Habsburgs had walked before him. But this time the aisles were sparsely filled. What was most painful was not the absence of strangers, but the silence of kin. The emperor himself did not linger at the coffin. Brothers and cousins stayed only as long as etiquette demanded. It was as though Maximilian had carried a contagion, not of the body, but of shame or suspicion, something best quarantined from memory. The people noticed. "He gave his life to God, and this is how they honor him?" asked a washerwoman at the Danube embankment. A tavern keeper muttered that if a man of Maximilian's blood could be forgotten so quickly, then commoners stood no chance of being remembered at all. But these voices were swallowed by the noise of the 30 Years' War rumbling across the continent. Armies moved, churches burned, treaties shattered. One archduke's death, however strange, was a footnote in a sea of catastrophe. Yet memory is stubborn. A few monks in the Teutonic Order lit candles for him every year, reciting prayers with an edge of quiet rebellion. For them, Maximilian had not been just another Habsburg pawn. He had been their Grand Master, a man who at least carried the illusion of honor, even if politics clipped his wings. In their cloisters, whispers of his death carried an undercurrent of bitterness. He was loyal, and loyalty destroyed him. Years passed, and the children born after 1618 grew into adults who had never heard his name. His portraits gathered dust in attics. His books of theology were reshelved without inscriptions. Even in family genealogies, his life was reduced to a thin line. Maximilian, 1555 to 1618. No mention of pain, no mention of suspicion, just numbers, like coordinates on a forgotten map. This erasure was not accidental. It was strategy. For a dynasty that prided itself on divine legitimacy, any hint of foul play, any rumor of poison or betrayal, threatened the entire architecture of rule. Better to bury Maximilian twice, once in the earth and once in silence. But silence has its own cruelty. To be killed is tragedy. To be erased is annihilation. Maximilian's face, once reflected in courtly mirrors, was now invisible. His voice, which had once recited Latin prayers across vaulted chapels, no longer echoed in memory. Even the city where he died turned its face away, as though ashamed of the suffering it had witnessed. And so the Archduke became a ghost, not the kind that rattles chains in corridors, but the quieter kind, lingering only in the margins of forgotten documents, hovering in the candlelit prayers of a dwindling brotherhood. Vienna had no monument for him. His grave, tucked among others, carried no eternal flame. A man who had lived 63 years, who had held high offices, who had been a prince of one of the most powerful families in Europe, was reduced to a rumor, a question mark whispered in the marketplace. Perhaps that was the true cruelty, not the agony of his final night, but the suffocating indifference that followed. Maximilian had dreamed of serving God, of defending Christendom, of leaving a trace upon the earth. Instead, he was left with nothing but a name, fading in the dark corridors of empire. Historians today still stand divided, staring at the silence left by Archduke Maximilian's sudden death. Was it merely food poisoning, a cruel but ordinary fate for many in the 17th century? Or was it something darker, sharper, deliberate? The truth remains buried under centuries of speculation. But what is undeniable is how perfectly timed his death was, coinciding with the very moment when Europe was about to plunge into its longest and bloodiest conflict, the 30 Years' War. Food poisoning, at first glance, seems reasonable. 17th century kitchens were not the pristine laboratories we imagine today. Preservation relied heavily on salt, smoke, and questionable cellars. Wine turned sour in barrels, bread carried mold invisible to the naked eye, and meat, even when spiced, often hid disease. A banquet could become a battlefield of bacteria. Many noblemen, even kings, succumbed to bad food, their bodies no different from peasants when poison or infection entered the stomach. Yet, there is a weight in Maximilian's case that lingers beyond mere coincidence. He was not an ordinary man. He was a Habsburg prince, head of the Teutonic Order, a figure deeply enmeshed in both religion and politics. At 63, his voice carried authority, his presence commanded respect, and his allegiance, Catholic, unwavering, was a pillar in an age when Europe was tearing itself between Catholic and Protestant faiths. His sudden removal cleared a path at a most dangerous hour. The 30 Years' War erupted in 1618, the very same year Maximilian died. It began with defiance in Prague, when Protestant nobles hurled imperial envoys from a window, igniting a chain reaction that would consume an entire continent. Austria, Spain, Bavaria, France, Sweden. Nations were dragged into the fire, and religion, cloaked in banners of faith, was often a mask for power, land, and survival. In such a storm, every prince mattered. If Maximilian had lived longer, some argue, he might have served as a mediator within his family, balancing the radical zeal of some Catholic rulers with a tempered, pragmatic approach. He had no legitimate children, but he carried the voice of seniority and the dignity of his office. He had negotiated before. He had commanded knights and governed lands. A living Maximilian might have slowed the momentum toward war, or at least altered the terms of Catholic participation. His absence created a vacuum, one swiftly filled by more aggressive figures. There are whispers in chronicles, subtle hints that his death was too convenient. Poison, after all, was the favorite tool of court intrigue. It left little trace, masked itself as natural illness, and gave rivals clean hands. The Habsburg court was not immune to such shadows. Ambition made even brothers and cousins into rivals. Could someone have slipped something into his wine, his food, his feast? The records are silent, but silence itself sometimes screams. What makes the speculation heavier is timing. In November 1618, Maximilian dies. By May 1619, Ferdinand II rises as Holy Roman Emperor, a man whose uncompromising Catholic stance fuels the war into full inferno. Ferdinand was not one to compromise with Protestants. He saw their existence as a threat to the very fabric of empire. Without Maximilian's moderating presence, the Habsburg response to rebellion hardened into iron. War was not simply likely, it became inevitable. Thus, Maximilian's death stands as a hinge moment. Had he lived, the balance of voices in Vienna might have shifted. The war may not have been avoided, but its character, its ferocity, its length, could have been reshaped. Instead, he vanished at the threshold of history's darkest European war, leaving others to define the empire's path. There is, however, another layer to the tragedy. If his death was truly natural, if it was food poisoning or disease, then fate itself mocked him. After decades of loyal service to crown and faith, after years of steering knights, advising kin, and enduring the shadows of power without ever wearing its crown, his story ended in the most humiliating way. Stomach pain, vomiting, collapse. Not in battle, not in glory, but in agony at a feast table. And maybe that is the cruelest truth. Whether poisoned by rivals or by spoiled meat, Maximilian's end became indistinguishable from assassination. In both cases, his body was destroyed by something ingested, whether an enemy's design or the kitchen's neglect. And Europe, watching the empire shift, could only wonder. Was he killed? Or was he merely unlucky? The question has never been answered. But the coincidence, his death at the very dawn of the 30 Years' War, makes it impossible to dismiss. His body, racked in pain, may have carried within it not just the sickness of one man, but the sickness of a continent about to tear itself apart. History has a strange way of remembering some lives while erasing others. Archduke Maximilian of Austria was not a king, not a crowned emperor, not the kind of figure school children recite in textbooks. He was a man caught between faith and power, devotion and politics, family loyalty and imperial suspicion. And yet, his death, violent in its suddenness, ambiguous in its cause, opened a window into how fragile the machinery of empire really was. Today, historians who sift through dusty archives in Vienna or comb through Vatican correspondences stumble upon his name like a ghost. Letters of condolence from other courts, mentions in papal reports, casual notes about the illness that carried him away. But beyond the paperwork lies the silence. A silence that speaks louder than the documents themselves, because silence often means erasure. In many ways, Maximilian's fate mirrors the countless forgotten royals who once stood at the margins of great empires. Men and women who did not rule but whose lives, if preserved, could have illuminated the shadows of history. He reminds us that history is not only about kings and battles, but also about the fragility of human bodies, the accidents of biology, and the unpredictability of death. And here lies the irony. The Habsburg dynasty is often remembered for its iron grip, its long genealogical roots, its rigid order of succession. Yet even within that fortress of bloodlines, one man could collapse over a banquet table and leave historians, centuries later, still asking, what really happened? The unanswered question is not just about cause of death, poison, food, or natural illness, but about consequence. What paths were altered by his absence? What if Maximilian had survived and influenced the escalating religious conflict? Would Catholic dominance in certain regions have been reinforced? Would the Protestant cause have been crushed earlier? Or would the Habsburg machine have fractured under internal rivalries even faster? It's a sobering reminder of how individual mortality can alter collective destiny. When one life disappears, history shifts, like a river forced to bend around a fallen tree. And there is another layer. His death forces us to consider the limits of historical certainty. We live in an age obsessed with answers, with forensic clarity, with evidence and proof. Yet the past does not always yield its secrets. Sometimes all that remains is ambiguity. And perhaps that is the most honest reflection of life itself, that not everything can be explained. Maximilian's story, then, becomes more than a tale of a Habsburg archduke. It becomes a mirror for us. How do we, in our own time, handle uncertainty? How do we deal with lives that end without neat conclusions? How do we remember the forgotten, whose contributions were subtle, hidden, or erased? Because beyond the halls of Vienna, beyond the Teutonic Order, beyond the Habsburg legacy, Maximilian's final lesson is one of humility. Even a prince can die like a common man, writhing in pain, bewildered, unheard. Even a dynasty built on power cannot protect its sons from the sudden strike of fate or of a hidden hand. And so, we return to that night in November 1618, the banquet table, the laughter that turned to whispers, the Archduke clutching his stomach, the confusion in the hall, servants running, the silence of dawn, and then the funeral bells. In that moment, the empire had lost not just a man, but a possibility. And we, centuries later, are left with the echoes. Maximilian does not ask us for tears. He does not need monuments or grand retellings. He asks us only for recognition, that his story, however incomplete, deserves to be told. Because to tell his story is to resist the quiet erasure of history. And to resist erasure is to affirm that even in ambiguity, even in silence, there is meaning. That is the catharsis of Archduke Maximilian's life. Not certainty, not answers, but the haunting truth that sometimes the most powerful tragedies are those we cannot fully explain. In the dim quiet of Vienna's Capuchin crypt, where the air feels heavy with centuries of sighs, one coffin rests among countless others. An archduke whose name has slipped into obscurity. Maximilian of Austria lies there still, wrapped in bronze and dust. A man who once carried the pride of empire, but who met his end in silence. The vault is lined with the iron faces of his dynasty. Emperors, empresses, kings, and queens, all preserved like shadows that refuse to leave. And somewhere in the rows, his tomb waits, small and almost unremarkable, as if history itself decided to dim the light on his memory. The camera lingers on that casket, surrounded by hundreds of others, all belonging to the House of Habsburg, the dynasty that stretched across Europe like an iron net. Yet Maximilian's coffin does not draw visitors. No flowers are left on its lid. No candle flickers for him. The Archduke has been absorbed into the silence, his story lost in the echo of larger names. Because the truth is, Maximilian's fate, whether by poisoned hand or rotten feast, matters less than what it tells us about the fragility of human power. He was born a son of an emperor, trained in the rituals of both politics and faith, shielded by one of the most formidable families in Europe. And yet, in one evening, at one table, with one breath, it all unraveled. It is a haunting reminder that even those who sit closest to thrones are still vulnerable to the quiet weapons of time, betrayal, and decay. The Archduke's fall mirrors the fragility of dynasties themselves. The Habsburgs fought to control kingdoms, churches, and armies. But they could not control the smallest, most intimate failures of the body. They could not prevent a glass of wine from turning to venom, or a meal from becoming a tomb. For me, this story is not just about Maximilian. It is about the silence that follows the forgotten dead. History writes in bold strokes for emperors and conquerors, but its ink fades quickly for those who linger in the margins. And Maximilian's coffin, left unvisited, left unnamed in the minds of most, is proof of that fading. I find myself wondering, how many more archdukes, queens, and princes lie beneath stone and dust, waiting for their names to be spoken again? How many lives ended in whispers, their suffering buried under the noise of battles and treaties? To speak them aloud, even now, is to resist the silence. And so, we return to his story. Not for the scandal of poison, not for the intrigue of court politics, but because remembering is itself an act of defiance against forgetting. Every forgotten coffin hides a truth about power, vulnerability, and the human condition. And every time we speak their names, we undo a little of that silence. The final shot holds steady on the Archduke's resting place. No statues, no gold, just the cold stone, the muted coffin, the stillness of centuries. And then, almost like a candle's flame against the dark, if you want these tragic fates, these buried stories, to live again, subscribe, like, and share. Because memory survives only if we keep speaking it.